This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Yasmina, for introducing me as well. So the introduction to the introduction, and it's a big honor to introduce Professor Ato Quayson, of course. It's very humbling and a very prestigious scholar, prolific intellectual, and an extremely generous colleague, and I would call him also say friend. So we're very honored that he took the time to travel and be in Vienna. And he's a very interdisciplinary scholar. There is no easy way to summarize the many things that he does. Let's start with saying he's a postcolonial specialist, expert, but also transnational studies scholar, diaspora studies, with a focus also on English literature, African studies, African literature, and more recently also a lot of interest in urban studies, postcolonial specialities, but also in the past and recently in more originally also disability studies, and I'll say a few things in a minute. So I've known Ato for a long time, physically from 2012 when he was invited to Utrecht for a public lecture in the Postcolonial Studies Initiative, which is a platform that I coordinate. Me and Birgit Kaiser, who's also part of EUTERPE and cannot be here today, we had this series called New Direction in Postcolonial Literary Studies. So Ato Quayson was, of course, the perfect speaker. And from there, many further collaborations started. But I remember Ato much before as a scholar, when in the 90s he was already putting really the dots on what this blossoming field of postcolonial studies was becoming. And he had, together with Theo Goldberg, this volume called Relocating Postcolonialism from 2002, Blackwell, in which all the big names were, of course, there. Monido Said, Kayari Spiva, Omi Baba, Laron Stollers. But it was more trying to think, what is the location of postcolonial studies? What do we want to do with it also in an interdisciplinary way? Trying to probe also new possible directions. And they were already mentioning the internet, which I found very remarkable in 2002. And the idea of this internet as a new technological epoch and as a portal of attitude. So I love that. And in that book already, there was this idea, Ato had a whole chapter on disability, this idea of not leaving certain topic to social sciences or to the medical humanities, but try really to make it part of the humanities and give the humanities a new edge to think about scale and sensibilities in different ways. So relocating the postcolonial as a way to see the postcolonial as a field that travel, and in this way of traveling to other places, to other disciplines, to other geopolitical location, gets new meaning, but because new forms of instability. So you've been kind of foundational for postcolonial studies, but just to give a little bit the biography as well from your very nomadic life, from Ghana to Cambridge University, where you taught for many years before going to Canada, the University of Toronto, where he was the founder and director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies for many years. Before he was seduced by the United States, the US, he moved to NYU, where our trajectory actually reconnected, where I was the happy on sabbatical professor at Columbia University. And we had some conferences in exchange. I was organizing a conference on mobility and migration. It was one of the speakers, but he had this beautiful postcolonial specialty and NYU, which also produced a special issues in many volumes. So it is very difficult to summarize. Now at Stanford in 2019 as Professor Jean and Norris Doyle Professor in Interdisciplinary Studies, but still in English Studies, so both of them. And he's been chair of the English department, but another remarkable thing that he managed to do was to be the founder of the African and African American Studies Department, which is the first one in Stanford, right? Stanford University. So a testament to his ability, pioneer quality, but also very skilled institutional power and navigation of the different fields innovative and at the same time consolidated many fields that need to be protected. It would be impossible to mention all the things that he published, the service that he gave, but I wanted to mention something that I participated in, which is this kind of monumental work, seminal, foundational, which was the Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature, 2 volumes, and it came out in 2012. But it has many of this kind of grand volume that really work toward consolidating the field, but also bringing a lot of colleagues and collaborators together. Blackwell Companion to Diaspora and Transnational Studies with Girish Dasvani in 2013. African Literature, an Ontology, Theory and Criticism in 2007. And more recently, the Cambridge Companion to the City in World Literature with Jeannie Kim Watson, 2023. And the last one, Decolonizing the English Literary Curriculum with Anke Mukherjee, Cambridge University Press in 2023. But more in terms of monograph, I already mentioned the work on disability studies. So Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability and the Crisis of Representation from 2007, in which it really links disability with imperialism and its subjection of otherness. So rethinking disability otherwise. In his very famous book, Oxford Street, Accra, City Life and the Itinerary of Transnationalism with Duke University Press 2014, which is also the show how versatile he is as a scholar, embracing such different fields in a studies of the city of Accra, which was mentioned by The Guardian as one of the 10 best books on cities. So a big compliment. And more recently, he published Tragedy and Postcolonial Literature with Cambridge University Press 2021, which was the winner of the Warren Books Prize in Literary Criticism. So it's really exploring key things between suffering and ethics through postcolonial literature from the Greek to Shakespeare to contemporary text. And I would say that he is admiring in Vienna the many Greek sculptures, and he wanted to know what the function and the role were of this sculpture. I said the neoclassical style, maybe you can give a better answer than me. If this was not enough for this kind of, I don't know whether this meant leap, but it's really extremely prolific and productive and generative of many international collaboration. Is also the general editor of the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry. It's also the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour, where he has this dialogue with different scholars on concept of the 21st century, and this ranges from the medieval to contemporary time, different geopolitical location, including both the North and the Southern Hemisphere. And to be mentioned is also his very special YouTube channel called Critic Reading Writing, which I think he developed during COVID because he was so restless and he had to find an audience and a public. He has this beautiful intervention really on all different topics in literature, urban studies, but also humanities and theoretical concept in general. And it's, of course, very beautifully curated, I have to say. You see, it's also extremely elegant as one of the few scholars to deserve this title after Edward Said. Is also as pluri-laureate member of many associations. He was the fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Science, fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, is fellow of the British Academy, and nominated in 2019, and recently fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science in 2023. So without further ado, the one and only brilliant Ato Quayson, who will be actually, I forgot to introduce you the title of his lecture, which was over there, Interdisciplinarity and Interpretation, Concept, Boundary and Contradiction. So we are very much looking forward to your brilliance as usual.
So thank you very much to Yasmina for all her seriousness and hard work in bringing me here. Sandra, who is an old friend and colleague, and she's also a magnificent scholar. She stepped in when I was editing the Cambridge History of Postcolonial Literature. She stepped in for an author who had flagged out, and we had barely, a month and a half to go for publication date. And she had just had a child. So she was on maternity and she wrote her chapter. So her, I consider a superhuman. What I'm going to share now is the introduction to a new book, the title of which is Interdisciplinarity and Interpretation, which is a collection of my own essays published over the past 20-something years. But I'm trying to link the work I've done. I'm trying to sort of establish an overview and to look at my own evolution as an interdisciplinary scholar. But to do that, I have had to pose some questions. I've had to interrogate the very concept of interdisciplinarity. Interpretation comes in as a shadow, but interdisciplinarity, and this is what I'm going to share. What is it? And what do we do when we claim to be interdisciplinary? So the first part will be conceptual, methodological, and then the second part, I'll go into the evolution of what I would like to describe as my ideational apparatus, the ideas in my mind that allow me to move, as she's pointed out, from field to field and be comfortable. Because there's actually method to the madness. So these are the opening gambits to the chapter. I saw Jesus walking on the demand curve. And this was a story that circulated. I went to high school in Ghana, boarding school, about a young man, not in our own school, who had woken up in the middle of the night screaming that he saw Jesus walking on the demand curve. So as I was thinking about this project, it came to my mind that he might actually have hit upon the conflation of metaphors that we often find working in interdisciplinary studies or interdisciplinary work. Because what more interdisciplinary than Jesus not walking on the sea, but walking on the demand curve? The second is a bit more complicated. And it is, as you can see, it's my professors had an ongoing competition to get the weirdest thing taken seriously under the label interdisciplinary program. Of course, this is a cynical take on interdisciplinarity. But the point that fascinates me in here is that it actually raises a question of methods. What is interdisciplinary method? Here, pendulums feature in both physics and psychology. But here, the pendulums are being operationalized in a way that flouts the requirements of both disciplines. So I take this also as a skeptical take on interdisciplinarity, which we have to deal with. Now, most universities, and I count Stanford also as one of them, they establish a false and pernicious dichotomy between what are termed foundational and basic research. Typically, this privileges STEM and policy-oriented work, which is the label foundational research, and demotes research in the humanities and social sciences as basic research. So they demote them to second-tier activities. And the consequence of this demotion is that research in the humanities and social sciences attract much lower funding. This is a standard discourse of any university administration you can think of. And yet no one reads Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason or Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime and asks what policy implications they might have. And yet it can readily be shown that his ideas have had a major impact not only in his home discipline of philosophy, but also in literary studies, anthropology, politics, environmental studies, and even in architecture. So the idea that somehow Kant can be reduced to basic research as opposed to foundational, when in fact his thinking has been foundational to any number of fields. But we'll come to this, we'll return to foundational versus basic later on. Now, one of the difficulties with talking about interdisciplinarity or describing it is that different institutional arrangements have historically been devised to house and support what is described as interdisciplinary work, including entire universities. The University of Sussex was established with an explicit manifesto to be interdisciplinary. Specific schools and departments, standalone institutes and centers, and survey courses firmly lodged within disciplinary curricula, to name just a few. Of course, these represent different scales of interdisciplinarity. So if you took the University of Sussex as an interdisciplinary institution, at least that was their original manifesto when they started, you would be looking at a different scale of interdisciplinary work than if we're looking at survey courses lodged within disciplinary curricula. And the different scale would generate different problems that would have to be accounted for. At the core of interdisciplinary work are two principles. First, that of integrative epistemologies that might be applicable to all fields of learning, including the sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, and the arts. Now, this particular integrative idea has been, debated since antiquity. Aristotle, Plato, and various philosophers worried about this. How do we generate an integrative epistemology that covers all things? So it's an old debate that has not yet been fully settled. But the second principle is that of unified or collaborative modes of knowledge that might be deployed for addressing real-world problems, such as environmental degradation, increasingly complex cities, water shortages, management, and so on and so forth. These real-world interventions, health crisis, COVID, for example, these big, interventions into real-world problems often require the assembling of different disciplines. So they cannot be left to one discipline alone. This is completely standard. In fact, there are entire units that are established precisely with this idea in mind. So centers for international relations, for example, may lean heavily toward political science, but they also have anthropologists in there. They also have discourse analysts or departments or units of public health, institutes of public health are also very interdisciplinary because public health is not something that can be limited to one discipline. So these are some, not so much definitions, but areas in which we can identify interdisciplinary work. Engaging in collaborative problem solving. This is what I just mentioned a moment ago. When a healthcare team of university researchers, clinicians, corporate officials, agency staff, and so on come together to tackle a particular health issue. So this is collaborative problem. The important feature is collaboration and problem solving. They have a problem to solve, which they need to collaborate over. There's another form of interdisciplinarity, which is bridge building between disciplines that somehow remain discrete. And this becomes prominent in the big debate in the 50s in the UK between C.P. Snow and F.R. Leavis, where C.P. Snow insists that the education in the United Kingdom in the 50s privileged languages, specifically Greek and Latin, to the detriment of the sciences. He was roundly condemned by F.R. Leavis, a literature professor. But this triggered a whole set of committees and, to try and bridge the two cultures. the impulse was to interdiscipline the educational curriculum. How do we produce a curriculum that is interdisciplinary, where students will gather skills from humanities, social sciences, and the sciences? The third is the Constitution. Here we will begin to recognize most of the work that we do. So the Constitution of new fields from overlapping areas of separate disciplines. So originally separate, and then they merge. So for example, psycholinguistics, criminology, Egyptology, urban studies, among others. Urban studies, which is a field I myself am interested in, brings together history, anthropology, sociology, architecture, and various others. So these are disciplines that, or fields, we call them fields, that emerged in the 20th century. So from the 20th century, lots of fields, they split and they are severed, and then parts of them are located elsewhere, like forensic linguistics. Forensic linguistics is taught at police academies, where your accent can place you within 4 blocks of a crime. So it's linguistics, but it's forensic. The number 4 is the development of synthetic theories that operate across disciplines: Marxism, structuralism, post-structuralism, general systems theory, etc., with foundational figures that are taken to guarantee the source codes for these theories: Aristotle, Bakhtin, Kant, Arendt, de Beauvoir, etc. Now, we begin to see more and more what most people pass off as interdisciplinary. The interdisciplinary work, because they're applying post-structuralism within anthropology, for example, when post-structuralism emerges first from literature and language studies. It's very, very common to see people claim to be interdisciplinary who are actually just applying insights from these synthetic umbrella theories. And then the final one is the borrowing of metaphors and procedures across disciplines, such as when literary studies turn to the history of science for an examination of the persistence and mutations of scientific ideas. Now, number 1, which is the engagement of collaborative problem solving, might be described as instrumental interdisciplinarity. It's instrumental because it wants to intervene in the world directly. All the others are examples of synoptic interdisciplinarity. They are synoptic in the sense that they take a bird's eye view or a God's eye view on either various fields, or they apply theories, synthetic theories, across various objects of interest. So examples of interdisciplinary programs that we will readily recognize: feminist, gender, and sexual. And by the way, these are disciplines and areas that self-declare themselves as interdisciplinary. All these will claim that they are interdisciplinary. And African and African American studies, American studies, Jewish studies, environmental studies, medical humanities, all these claim to be interdisciplinary. There are 2 problems, though, that I find. For example, I'm running a new department of African and African American studies. Even though on our website we claim to be interdisciplinary, strictly speaking, many of these programs are multidisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary. And the way that the curricula are designed, they are in the form of a menu of offerings. So the students are given a menu of offerings by different professors from different disciplines, and then they make of the menu what they will. It is very rare that the menu is converted into a specific dialogue of methods and concepts between more or among more than one discipline. So many departments, mine included, that claim to be interdisciplinary are actually multidisciplinary. And there are reasons for this, not the least of which is actually resources. Now, there's a weakness, or there are weaknesses to both the synoptic and the instrumental. And that is all the definitions of interdisciplinarity we have looked at. However, the weakness is that they signally ignore the degree to which individual disciplines are internally differentiated according to sometimes contrasting protocols of proposition making. And this is a key thing that I'm going to worry about in my book. What do we mean by protocols of proposition making? I'm going to give you just a few ideas about what I make of this problematic. So, for example, 4 field departments of anthropology, these are the sub-segments of anthropology departments: social, cultural, biological, and archaeological anthropology, have such distinctive concepts and methods. And sometimes they actually dismiss the others. So biological anthropologists think that cultural anthropologists are just wasting time. And the archaeologists also think that all the others are complete losers. In fact, there are stories of 4 field anthropology departments that have had to break up because the different fields, subfields, do not agree on concepts and methods. But take also literary studies. Medieval and Shakespeare studies, with their emphasis on knowledge of various European languages, often including Latin and Greek, along with the principles of etymology. And this is I arrive at this partly because I've written a couple of things on Shakespeare. There's no serious Shakespearean scholar who is also not an etymologist. They love etymologies. They also demonstrate facility in various languages, Latin and Greek being just one, sometimes French, and so on. And on top of that, they also have mastery of non-literary discourses such as history of music, medicine, and so on for their respective field. And this applies specifically to, or most strongly, in the medieval and Shakespeare studies. If you were writing on Virginia Woolf and Chinua Achebe, none of these would be relevant to your enterprise. In other words, even in departments of English, the subfields have such contrasting methods and concepts, conceptual apparatuses, that it is not unusual for quarrels to break up or to break out from time to time about the definition of the mother field. What is English literary studies? What is it? When the Shakespeareans and medievalists are doing something so completely different. And in fact, they think that postcolonial scholars working on Achebe or Toni Morrison are losers, because what kind of scholarship is this? The point I'm making is that protocols of the proposition making are necessary not just between disciplines, but sometimes within disciplines, such that if I was writing something on Shakespeare, which I have done, it has to be recognizable to the proposition-making protocols in Shakespeare studies, and not just for postcolonialists. I've received quite a few papers for my journal, the journal that I edit, the Cambridge Journal of Postcolonial Literary Inquiry, which purport to be Shakespearean and which I've dismissed out of hand because they are deploying the wrong protocols. They are postcolonials who are treating Shakespeare as if with postcolonial protocols, and that doesn't work. So for me, they have to produce work that is recognizable to the protocols of that other field. So that interdisciplinarity ought to entail a firm grasp of different protocols of proposition making. Even though Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is well known, famous, many people have delved into it, has had a major impact on the conceptions of literary history, What was actually borrowed from this signal work by literary critics was not Kuhn's discussion of science, but rather his elaboration of the changing rhythms of scientific problems and the quest for their solution. In other words, it was the particular set of Kuhn's propositions related to the evolution of epistemologies that was taken up in the humanities. Some scientists and philosophers of science were not enamored of Kuhn's protocols of proposition making and accused him of lack of complexity and objectivity, as well as being somewhat irrational. So that among scientists, Kuhn makes no sense. The point I'm making, that for many scientists, his ideas about the structure of scientific revolutions is not scientific at all. In other words, what Kuhn did is that he used science, or the history of science, to actually transcend science and to appeal to other disciplines which saw what he was doing as but especially useful. Whereas his home fields were skeptical. So a historian reading a literary scholar's contribution to the history of slavery should be able to get a clear sense of historiography from it, such as the way the literary scholar attends to historical archives, for example. While a literary critic should be able to enter the realm of history from the domain of literary details that are explored. Thus, both of them, on studying, say, Toni Morrison's Beloved, should be able to grasp the other's protocols of proposition making, so that the literary scholar using Beloved to talk about the history of slavery should be recognizable to the historian. And the historian using Beloved to talk about slavery should also demonstrate a mastery of literary details. Otherwise, they'll be reading it just for discrete facts, which has happened before, by the way. It happens all the time. So people read Achebe's Things Fall Apart for discrete facts about the ego. This happens all the time, where in fact, it's completely a misreading. I tell my students that reading Things Fall Apart is not like reading the New York Times. The New York Times is journalism. It's supposed to be factual, whereas Things Fall Apart is a literary work and has to be read primarily as literary. What is the difference, for example, in the constitution of an event? And this is what is something that where history and literature meet, or literary criticism meet. What is the difference, for example, in the constitution of an event as opposed to an incident as a proper field of attention by the historian versus how a literary critic establishes the parameters of an event? I've been thinking of this quite a bit, especially since there's a chapter on Achebe that I have in Tragedy and Postcolonial Literature, where I started worrying. I didn't fully deal with this question in that chapter. And I'm digressing slightly, but I'll come back. My tentative conclusion is that an event is a set of happenings. Sometimes it's a cluster. It may cluster around some cataclysm. But the clustering is not as important as the consequences that emerge out of it. And literary scholars also know that an event is what drives an aspect of the plot. So a protagonist is the one that affects events, or that affects the consequence. Any character to whom events happen, but for whom no consequences ensue, is a minor character. I'm simplifying here. And so when you look at historian or in history, September 11th is an event. And events also generate a problem of interpretation. September 11th is one major cataclysmic event. But even to this day, people have not exhausted its interpretation. In other words, an event triggers a crisis of interpretation, whereas an incident can be scaled down to a singular meaning. And this eventfulness can be tackled from both a historical or historian and a literary perspective, because both historians and literary critics are interested in events and eventfulness. So this is one way of, bringing together these protocols of proposition making. The question of protocols of proposition making raises serious questions about how scholars purporting to be interdisciplinary are trained, which also means a conscious self-awareness of the limits of their own primary disciplines and the preparedness to properly learn from the rigorous protocols of other disciplines, and not just as is convenience. This actually raises major implications for how we educate, how our curricula are developed, and how we educate our students. Now, some people have argued, and I tend to agree with this proposition, that you cannot be truly interdisciplinary without mastering one discipline. I completely agree with this. But there is something that needs to be added, which is that in mastering your own discipline, you should understand what its protocols of proposition making are. We often master our disciplines almost osmotically. It's by if you stop us and ask us, so what does it mean to read? How do you know a classic when you see it? How do you know that this is going to be a classic? We start fumbling. That's happened to me before. We start fumbling and so on. The point is that it is not just understanding your discipline, but understanding the protocols within it, and especially the divergent ones. I've already mentioned Shakespeare and the medieval studies versus studies of Achebe. Now, it is this understanding that actually the protocols have a history. So they didn't emerge. There's nothing natural about protocols in any discipline. They have a history. To understand the historical nature of the protocols is also to be made aware or to be alerted to the constructed nature of the protocols in other disciplines. Rather than taking, which is normally what we do, we take a metaphor from here and, a concept from there, and we put it all together in a nice United Nations intellectual soup. And then we offer it as interdisciplinary. But we actually haven't understood even the protocols within our own disciplines, never mind the next discipline. So these are some, it's not so random because they are works I'm familiar with and I consider them truly interdisciplinary. However, I want to make a distinction between the first two, Edward Said's Orientalism and Stephen Greenblatt's Renaissance self-fashioning. And that is that Said and Greenblatt are on a par with Averbach, Northrop Frye, Martin Nussbaum, and to a lesser degree, Harold Bloom, as large-scale synthesists. Now, their synthesism was itself drawing on diverse conceptual pools. So you cannot reduce Said's Orientalism to one discipline. His concept, he drew them from different disciplines. And it so happens that all these people are also multilingual in the extreme. They speak at least 2 languages. But the fact of the scale of their synthesism also allows their books to be multi-generative. So that different disciplines, because they've synthesized so many concepts, different disciplines feel comfortable to take from them and do whatever they want. These are different. So Said and Greenblatt, along with Nussbaum, Frye, and Averbach, are different interdisciplinarians. They are synoptic interdisciplinarians, but as it were, homeless. You can't lock them into a single location. They are perambulatory interdisciplinarians. That's different from the next set, who are actually interdisciplinary, explicitly merging insights and protocols from 2 distinct fields. So Christopher Norris's quantum theory and the flight from realism is actually a book that was much admired when it was first published by physicists, because he actually really thoroughly grounded himself in the physics of quantum theory. Same with Karen Barad's Meeting the Universe Halfway. Again, quantum physics and philosophy, ethics, and so on. Or Gillian Beer's Darwin's Plot, which is, in a way, the easiest to grasp of this list. Because what she did was that she took Darwin's theory of evolution as a form of literary history, and then applied it to the 19th century novel, and so on and so forth. Now, the distinction I'm making between the large-scale synthesis, in which Said being exemplary, and the interdisciplinarians melding two or more disciplines, is that the large-scale synthesis, as I said earlier, are homeless interdisciplinarians. You can't actually log them into one single discipline. Whereas the second set are, you can see that you can derive where they come from and where they are borrowing and where they are going. It's quite most humanists aspire to the first mode of interdisciplinarity, the synoptic mode represented by Said, Greenblatt, and so on. Except that to achieve that, you have to read a lot, because those guys read everything. So now my own journey, because the book is trying to trace my journey into being an interdisciplinary scholar. Now, when I was thinking about actually this lecture, because the first point is not actually, I've not written it up. It struck me that a fundamental, almost epiphany, but at the time I didn't recognize it as an epiphany, was encountering Freud's interpretation of dreams. I was like 16, 17. The worst time to read Freud. You cannot even imagine. Because I don't tell you the story of how I chanced on this book at the library, but I was so enamored of his mode of interpreting dreams that I set myself up as the neighborhood dream interpreter. And every Saturday, my friends and, all sorts of people, I sat in my father's living room, and then they came and then told me their dreams. And they were all easy to interpret, a la Freud, that bicycle, small bicycle that you're riding up the hill that you couldn't quite make go up, is that girl, the neighborhood girl, who happens also not to be very tall. Did you realize that? At any rate, more important than my very small scale Freudian interpretation of dreams was that I suddenly came to understand poetry. At the time, I also was a great devourer of poetry. I started out as a poetry, not a poetry scholar, but more interested in poetry than prose narrative. And the reason why Freud's interpretation of dreams was so important was that his notion of the difference between manifest and latent content, the manifest content and latent content, was extremely attractive as a theory of language, as a theory of poetry. That every poem, especially lyric poetry, had layers like an onion that had to be peeled. So this, and remember, I was only 16, 17. This model of interpretation is what I would say launched me into being a literary critic. So, what people call not politics, that suspicion. Yeah, for me, there's no suspicion at all. It's just the understanding that there's something mysterious about literary language, and that what you see is not necessarily what you get. And I got that straight from Freud. But the other thing that I got from Freud, and this came to me much later, that the literariness, in a way, I read interpretation of dreams as if it was a novel, but with practical consequences. But the other thing that also came with the understanding of manifest and latent is that it was not just literary writing that was mysterious, but the world itself. That is to say, that it was possible to subject the world of forms to a similar kind of interpretative attention that Freud had demonstrated in his work. It took me many years to try and apply a semblance of this in my book, Calibrations, Reading for the Social, in which I describe the social as being a configuration, but a configuration similar to how literature is a configuration. And that requires a mode of attentiveness, unpeeling, and so on and so forth. So I would call that my first ideational apparatus, which I grasped. I read Interpretation of Dreams like 3 times in quick succession over a period of 3 weeks. And then subsequently another 3 times until I was 24, and I never read it again. And I'm deciding, I was in conversation with a colleague of mine at Anki Mokeji, that I want to write an article, an essay, simply titled 7 Readings of Freud. And basically, I'm going to try and see what the 7th read, because I haven't read it after the 6th time, age 24, I never read it again. However, it was coming into formal education, because my Freud reading had nothing to do with my schoolwork at all. I was in high school at the time, toward the end of high school, but I was an avid reader of anything that I laid my hands on. So this was completely informal. But my formal education in the 1980s was, in a way, it also set up almost the infrastructure of a crisis in my consciousness. First is that I was grilled, and I loved it at the time, the demands of close reading. Literary scholars will understand what I'm talking about: close reading, reading for detail, and somehow cutting off the rest of the world from the exercise of close reading. My favorite teacher at the time was a man called Aloysius Denkabi. He's a Catholic. And he was phenomenally lazy. He never returned our scripts to us. He was extremely lazy, but his mind at the time, I thought he had the mind of God. He spoke extremely slowly and extremely quietly. So you had to really strive to understand it. He was a magical close reader of anything written. And the way he would unpeel the text. So this inducted me, and I was so much attracted to this model of close reading that I took it on board in practice. However, this classroom practice and training in close reading went against or brushed against a major crisis that was unfolding in the 1980s in Ghana. I grew up in Accra, Ghana, which was that the country had been taken over by a military junta run by a guy called Jerry John Rawlings. There was a lot of brutality, a lot of violence, a lot of embarrassing things happened. So all the time, I and my friends alongside me worried what was the point of practical. On the one hand, I love practical criticism, but what was the point of doing practical criticism when the world was ablaze around us? So, and there was no way of squaring it, because Alo, who taught us practical criticism and also the history and theory of criticism, would not tolerate. He happens also to have been a Marxist. So he was very good at dialectical interpretations, but he never allowed us to import the outside world into the class. But we're all, struggling with the meaning of the crises that were unfolding. So this was a crisis for me. The next phase of my ideational interdisciplinary infrastructure was actually teaching the tragedy paper at Cambridge. As Sandra mentioned earlier, I taught at Cambridge. I did my PhD there, and I taught there for 10 years. And I was thrown into teaching the tragedy paper, which is compulsory. Now, one of the things that I realized very quickly on teaching the tragedy paper was how little bearing it had on the tragedies in the real world, of which there were many. Raymond Williams's book, Modern Tragedy, had attempted to answer this schism between literary tragedy and the real world, but his focus was post-Second World War Europe. So he wasn't that much interested in the parts of the world that I was interested in. And the crisis for him was, what do we do about the debris of post-Second World War Europe? And how might tragedy aid in understanding the debris that had emerged, the ruins that had emerged in Europe. So he was useful, but not enough for the problems that I was wrestling with. But the thing about the tragedy paper also is that it allowed for what can only be described as a form of incipient interdisciplinarity. So even though the texts were literary and the Greeks and Shakespeare were compulsory parts of the tragedy paper, followed by the modernists and any other, traditions you might be interested in. But apart from the literary text, people could write on painting, photography, philosophy, religion, television, practically anything, film. So that in teaching the paper and in interacting with students and marking papers, I saw how the concepts of tragedy, suffering, fate, determinism, and free will, contingency, and so on, could be unthreaded from fields not literary. So you could get a whole paper on painting or on philosophy, which will be trying to unthread these ethical problems. So that was very useful for me, because I taught it for so long and I was so immersed. It's for that, on first coming to Vienna, I noticed immediately the number of Greek statues of Greek gods. In fact, the king's, the garden, the King's Summer Palace is full of Greek statues. There is Zeus is in there, Athena is in there. But why does Vienna, in fact, I even suggested in a small piece I wrote after my visit that there are more Greek statues in Vienna than anywhere else in Europe outside of Rome, in Greece. But why? I've still not got an answer to that. I mean, Sandra was telling me it's a neoclassicism, but why neoclassicism in Vienna? Is it because it's a kind of fanning the embers of the old empire, the idea of the Austro-Hungarian? But if in that case, why the Greeks? It's a question that I'm sure it will exercise your intellect. But by far the most interdisciplinary work that I've undertaken was Oxford Street, Accra. Now, this book, I did my intellectual life. There's a before and an after. So there's before Oxford Street and there's after Oxford Street. Now, I consider Oxford Street a before and after for a variety of reasons. So first is that before Oxford Street, I had no interest in history, especially historiography. I thought historians were so dull. No, I really did. But now, after writing the book, because first of all, I had to devise, and I couldn't remember dates for the life of me. But in researching and writing the book, I had to devise a grid, to plug in different historical dates and the connections between different dates and so on, such that now I am a Greek. If I was to return to do my undergraduate studies, I would be a historian, without a doubt. I remember some years ago, 2014, a master's student of mine who was from the Ukraine, came to my class to talk about her work. And I asked her a little bit about Ukraine, so she said a bit. And I said, I want you to send me references to the history of Ukraine. I am actually interested in the history of Ukraine. She looked at me like I had pissed myself. She was why would I be interested in the Ukraine? So she left. She never sent me the references. 2 weeks later, Putin invaded Crimea. Just like that. I remember telling my daughter when she went to University of Toronto, she did a history course and was complaining bitterly. And I told her, look, listen here, girl. Every history you read is about you. It's literally about you. It doesn't matter whether it's Ukraine or Greece, or every history is about you. The reason is that the problems that the historical actors are facing and the choices they are required to make are human problems that could be replicated in your own life. So you're not reading about the history of Ukraine because you are interested in the Ukrainians. You're interested in yourself. So as I thought, did she listen to me? Of course not. So there's one thing that completely transformed my consciousness of the necessity for a historical consciousness. The second thing that emerged was also what now I recognize as interdisciplinarity of protocols of proposition making. However, one of the things I was accused, by the way, I think unjustly, that I was asked once, how come as a literary scholar, I was writing a book like this in urban studies? And I thought about, and it was posed cynically by an anthropologist, no less. And I thought about it for a while, and I came to the conclusion that actually, this is the most literary book I've ever written. The reason is that the method by which I identify what is an important detail is the exact same method that I use to read details in literature. Not only that, any detail in literature that I read, I immediately connect it to other aspects of the text that may not seem immediately available to consciousness. So I assume on encountering the detail that there must be something else hiding behind it, going back to the Freudian manifest versus latent. And so each phenomenon that I identify in Oxford Street is a phenomenon that already has entailments. Whether I know what the entailments are, and this is straight from literary. The book is also full of anecdotes. It's a very anecdotal book. I love gossip, which the business schools call organizational storytelling. What you and I call gossip, they call organizational storytelling. And they teach and award grades for organizational storytelling. So please never dismiss gossip. It's really important to understand the goings and comings in the world. So these were some of the disciplinary, foci, anthropological fieldwork, which I admit was only partially ethnography. So I used to spend hours sitting on the street, chatting with vendors of various kinds, food vendors, vendors of phone cards, and so on and so forth, and trying to find out anything I could find out about them. But unlike the anthropologists, I was not interested in going home with them and embedding them in their family conditions. That I had no interest in. I was only interested in their interactions with clients and their buyers and so on. So that was the limit of my ethnography. My ethnography of the street was, how does this vendor relate to people on the street? That's all I'm interested in. So the anthropologists would say that I'm not really an anthropologist, because a true anthropologist would have gone further, found out who they were married to. I have no interest in that. I was only interested in the food vendor, how she decided on whom to extend food credit to. By the way, that's a whole, business schools should hire me to tell them something about that. Who does the food vendor in an African country, and how do they determine whom to extend food credits to? There's a whole, anyway. So anthropology, history, I've already mentioned the nature of events, cycles, and so on. And then, of course, literary criticism. The entire book is driven by literary critical methods, even though there were only three literary texts that I referenced in the entire book. And then, of course, there were many theoretical concepts. Now, from Bakhtin, I took the idea of chronotopes. As we know, chronotope is a space-time, and Bakhtin was extracting the principles of chronotopes from the history of Western literature, from the medieval period, actually from the classical period down. And he arrives at 6 chronotopes, which are repeated throughout Western European history. And these are the road, the castle, the parlor, the small town, the threshold. The road, he says, gives an opportunity for demonstrating social heterogeneity. So Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, it's governed by a road chronotope. And that chronotope is all about social heterogeneity. And you find it again and again in chronotope novels or films and so. And then, of course, he also has the parlor. The parlor can also include the dance hall, the cafe, the versions of the parlor. But the parlor is often about plots, about plotting. In Anna Karenina, for example, the big parlor, the big ballroom scenes are where all the plots happen, and so on. So he is right, except that I think that the chronotopes have to be, the range have to be extended. And also they have to be distinguished between chronotopes of aggregation and chronotopes of disaggregation. An airport is a classic chronotope of disaggregation because its objective is to redistribute people as quickly and efficiently as possible. So you get to an airport and the objective is to get you to leave. And the reminder that the airport is not your home is actually encoded in the countless announcements of flight departures, especially if your flight is delayed. Because if your flight is delayed, every ding-dong, Lufthansa flight 645, you think they're talking about you and they're poking you in the eye. Why are you still there? In other words, so it's a chronotope of disaggregation, much like railway terminals and so on. And chronotopes of aggregation have a particular specific morphology. So the morphology of the chronotope of disaggregation is different from, say, the baseball stadium, which is a chronotope of aggregation. So the baseball stadium is a chronotope of aggregation, especially during the game, whereas an airport is consistently a chronotope of disaggregation and so on. Anyway, I use Bakhtin's theory to try and assess and analyze different features of Accra in terms of their aggregative and disaggregative features. I ran a course on interdisciplinary urban studies for my students at Stanford. And it's very fascinating to get them to see the university itself as a chronotope with different rhythms. And so we break down the entire university into the different locations in the university and the way they all are assigned values, either chronotopic values, either aggregative or disaggregative, and what this means for them in their daily lives and routines as students. Finally, interdisciplinarity is an aspiration often of curricula, but curricula are designed completely differently. And I'm thinking here of the difference between the curricula in the United Kingdom and the US. Because I was stunned and utterly shocked to realize when I moved to the US, actually North America, Toronto was also the same, that students could take any course in any subject until their second year before they declared. So an enterprising student would take something in art history, in mathematics, in physics, in creative writing, what have you. This was quite different from how I was educated, but also in the United Kingdom where I taught, where you are inducted into one single discipline. So you're admitted to Cambridge or Oxford to do English, and that's the end of it. And yet somehow both systems of education produce interdisciplinarians. So this is something I've been thinking about. How come that distinctive, educational systems still produce great interdisciplinarians, and yet on the face of it, on looking at the design of the curricula, they don't seem to have that as they're more the Americans are more multidisciplinary, and the Brits are more monodisciplinary. And yet, at the end of the cycle, some of them tip over into interdisciplinarity. This is not a question I have resolved as yet. And when I manage to resolve it, I hope I can come back to tell you my findings. Thank you very much.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.